Again in studio, this time about different forms of stocks, but also life and workers that do not understand life. It is very hard to see or to see any architecture or even elite arts. Uh, Once you do not understand anything, 90% of people look on something, but they try to understand. And it's like people in United States of America or in Europe, they would try to understand language they do not know, some Chinese, Japan, Italian, Austrian, German language, or even American Latin language they do not understand. Once you look at those people, they try to explain to you something. You will not understand what they're trying to tell you, even if they are civil guards or different forms of medical departments or doctors, they are trying to tell you something, but you will not understand that. So if you do not understand people, there are a lot of problems. If you do not understand language, but also what they try to explain to you in astronomy or biology, you'll have bigger problems also with mathematics and the way you want to live. So the more you are going to explore other culture, nothing is for sure, and you will look at those Spain or whatever you think about some strange French language, you will not understand what to do. So the ethics and the way you are actually behaving is more simple imagery. So in the term of image, of course, there also exists some ethics. And to understand simple forms, it's not easy. To understand life also, it's not easy. If you see the language that you do not understand, of course, in real life, it is very, very difficult to understand all forms of recipe that medicine could have, but partly actually related to all those cultures and nerves those cultures have. It is also very important to try to understand things, but whatever humans see include very, very difficult forms. And of course, humans also have the optics about life and what they see. To understand different forms of literal form together with architecture, it's not easy. But also to understand the nerve in life, it's not easy because you have millions of nerve inside a body. You also have the orbit, which is circulating with simple energy, which is not related to anything medical or anything related to sound. Also, nothing to related to electronic or internet things. It is very difficult to understand different boats of life, but also how those boats are functioning. A lot of people do not understand how hard it's to understand things that you could not understand. When you see some literacy that you do not understand, you might become extremely confused or even depressed because sometimes you want to understand that more, but you could not because you're trying to write those scenarios you see, but nothing function properly. So, of course, there is confusion about everything human might see, and it's not easy to understand those durations together, how much time that will actually take. To heal self, of course, it's also not easy, and a lot of people will hear strange voices or even other voices that are trying to tell them something to build a better life. Of course, it's not easy. And also to understand better life of human, it's not easy. Once you do not understand something, you'll have illusions because people once trying to understand something and you could not understand, you'll have a lot of illusions about that. The dangerous illusion is actually fear that humans have. Once people have fear, they want to get rid of everything they see or is near them. To understand different forms of life, it's not easy, but also how much illusions could human actually have. It is not easy to understand, but also the owners might be confused when they see the language they do not understand or some form in work or leading they do not understand of all. Of course, it's not easy to understand different forms of circle, bigger or smaller, outer or inner, but also how much inch it take you are going to understand some language or imagery. To understand different forms of life, it's not easy, but also to understand the way the insects are inside. The insects are actually some sort of animal, usually also flying, or are very, very visual form. And once you are going to think about that, or if that is related to human, you are going to see how hard it is to understand insects. Also, to understand different forms of leaders or what they really are, some sort of vision of animals, and just do damage to human, you are not going to understand what they are thinking about colors or different dimensions they are actually able to the life. To understand different concepts, what leaders means, or even how much ill they could do in life, it's also not easy. The workers, of course, do not understand everything, but also the leaders have imaginary misconceptions and they do not all have proper value. So, in that case, the leaders might be prohibited in many scenarios of me. Also, to understand different forms of monkeys is not easy because they are behaving extremely strange, especially if there is any crisis. To understand different colonies, but also millions years ago, once my book was made, is also not easy. But also to understand different forms of female and their psychology together with neuroerotics, which are extremely dangerous, especially if you compare them to other species. So, no woman or man should be compared to other humans. It is also not easy to understand the visual part of legs, hands, heart, or five main organs, including the kidneys and the livers. Of course, the head is the most complex, and the things humans see are not easy. You can actually protect them with millions of helmets if you are going to think about that. Put that in my vision also. To understand different forms of optics, it's not easy. And once you think about optics, the problems in that form, it's not easy. Of course, optics are some sort of literacy problem because it's very hard to see any figure in that phenomenon area. To understand books in medicine, it's not easy, but also different forms of diverse forms of author. To understand different forms of life, it's not easy, and once you try to understand visual forms, it becomes extreme hard. You are see some visual form and you try to figure it out what is beauty, and you could not figure it out that. Even if you take rentgen of your bone, of any beauty bone, you'll only see how difficult it is to understand any human. It is very hard to understand humans, even if you are a little bit more in medicine. Different forms of optics occur what you see in medicine sector, but also what is available for you if you have some license. Of course, if you have license for some things, you can also own a card on which you have the details of your license or what do you mean with your license. In the term of optics, there are also different forms of simple macula, vitreous humor, fibra, optic nerve, retina, sclera, iris, cornea, pupil, and lens. Cornea must actually be quite good if you are thinking about different forms of life. The pupil, of course, can sense beauty, but also the inner beauty to some point, and it's not easy to understand different forms. The design robot actually means you might see everything from inside of universe, but you might not see the world. In terms of that, with no Rob, you'll understand how complex some designs might be under the terms of what you want to do with self with some design. To see any human body, it's not easy with some inner optics, but in the term of simple retinal form with secure central form of body, it's not easy to understand every artery or what is wrong with some people. Of course, there is this concentration when it comes to crisis, but also choroid parts are very, very strange. Of course, there are millions of capsules that people put their blood inside if there are doctors that are taking that blood. But to understand chambers together with pupil, cornea, and iris is also important. There are millions of different lenses and what you can do with your life. It is also not easy to understand simple atoms of life, but also anatomy together with cornea. Of course, it is very, very difficult to understand different illusions that humans have, but also what humans see or how hard is actually to understand different language. The different culture might include very, very difficult forms, especially the taste of richer, the sight of richer, the smell of richer, or touch of richer, and hear of richer. The robot actually is designed that is very psychologically made, of course, for some only concept, but with no rock and more dependent structure on the terms author might have. And of course, that might be only for the authors, because the others might see or even experience the failure of that design, unless you'll see the descriptions that author give to the humanity. To understand that richer taste it's not easy, simply if you can turn it off or on. Of course, on the internet, the taste, sight, smell, touch, and hear are completely off because of the security terms that somehow some people have to themselves. The sight change when you see anything electronic, and you'll understand how unreal those packaging in those fabrics could be, or what people claim about themselves about those packages. Even those that are on some positions in different forms of fabric might have a total wrongly made site about what license should receive or what license should actually hear. To understand different forms of touch, it's not easy once you mention anything related to love, and that can quickly become crime if you abuse love or touch. Criminology. It is very difficult art police forum, which means it's more art but much, much more guarded. Each store, of course, contains a book that is available to any human in city, but is also not easy to understand how people can smell that book to find it, especially adults. Their smell sometimes is more important. Of course, my self-term is there is no smell, sometimes even no touch, and sometimes even no hearings. To understand different diagrams, it's also not easy when it comes to more simple medicine form. Also, to understand different forms of discovery, how things actually work in life, it's not easy. Of course, medicine can use standard microscope to study different cells, but also different forms of body, especially those that are maybe simply more evolved or more advanced. Any evolution, of course, also fails at some point in life, and there are millions of concepts or what humans actually see in different forms of sounds. There might actually be the nerve next to their low position, or People that are more known might have slightly more knowledge about hearing and how much dysfunction could be with that, and they could easily abuse that. That's why sometimes it is very important to understand different forms of simple sound, but also the optics that some pretty people have. Once you try to understand pretty, you'll have different meanings in life. To understand different forms, but also misconceptions that occur in human body is not easy. To understand that some people might never see difference in life, especially if there are extreme religious form, is very important. To understand the theory of different forms of religious forms is important, but also the theory of medicine. Sometimes when humans see whatever they see, it's very difficult. Me also have some simple oils and patented picture that me made with oils. Those are worth a lot in the term of the price in currency, but the price in art form, it is not measurable. Of course, it's not easy to get in Louvre or different museums to be exponented there, even if you make beautiful old picture. Me also think to build some sort of simple Mona Lisa, but would probably be half woman and half man, or even some sort of guitar religious form people follow every day in their habits, especially in the morning when they start to work. Different forms of happiness might appear next to guitar, and that one actually become very dangerous if you don't understand psychology. Also, the way money can be weighed together with guitar, everything become more complex because it's very difficult imagery of my life. Also very difficult to understand science point of guitars, which are of course related to some concerts. The security on concerts is not easy, and of course the main problem. Together with different shadows of life, but also how to find the next simple level together with your wallet and the fortune you can actually spend to understand different forms and that your fortune are actually the instrument you understand to play on. It is not easy, but also to understand different forms of begging in life. Some people are begging to their doctors to give them something, but some others are simply purchasing different forms of cosmetics and heal their life. The cosmetics are some sort of imagery, but also to understand different forms of imagery together with different forms of humans. The humans should not be related to each other because they can simply abuse each other. If you see any link in any company in this world, that is a crime. The links are crime because they are linking anything together. Also, any breach is a crime. And if you see any bigger company or bigger art link anything or linking, you'll see the way they are doing their crime. Of course, in extreme case, they could go to the jail. But to some point, it is very important to understand simple forms of life also together in this world or together with your family. The family in this world might be all people for me, but to some point you'll understand how different all the humans are. Once you understand different forms of wall art, you'll also understand different forms of property and how the walls are actually extreme material forms. The materialism it's not easy concept because with materials everything is made. With different forms of material carvings, different forms of life are made and also different forms of various different banks and ledgers. Of course, it's not easy to understand different private banks in this life, but also different carving walls together with extreme art buildings. Sometimes in Old York, the walls are overrated and sometimes even underrated. Different forms of wooden carvings appear in richer society. and is not possible to see anywhere. In all New York, but also in California, richer parts, you'll see millions of wolf wooden carvings, but also some wooden flowers and wooden simple forms of the history together with eagle. The eagle is quite popular in American culture, but me would refer also to the wooden dragons. The dragons are not the doctors, but the dragons also in my literacy represent the symbols of simple form. Not too much fame, but actually the concepts of simple medicine together with better and better cosmetics. The packing in styling with cosmetic it's not easy, and style it's completely different than different packings. There are also different bears in wooden culture, and if you think about that wooden culture sometimes it is not dressed, you can think even about very difficult carvings and different forms of extreme statues that appears on undressed figure. The figure are very difficult, especially when it comes to different forms of wolves and different forms of Buddhas made from wood. It is very difficult to understand wood and different forms of how the art could actually be if you make more photos. The photos that represent the reality to some point, but also different forms of table, different forms of controversial in politics, but the entire political forms and how the politics are actually burning together with different culture. On the end, everything could disappear because each human is some sort of statue. To understand different forms of imagery or even different forms of concepts, it's not easy. The packing different medical forms together with wood is definitely not easy for them. And all over the world, there will be the poverty, even in wooden realms, but also in medical forms, even in picture forms of life. To understand picture of life might be the most complex, especially because good pictures give good life and evil picture give evil life. In cosmetics, nuns, priests, but also different forms of imagery of religions are extreme fiction, but people like to follow fiction a lot. If society from that point is actually made on fiction, it is very hard to understand different forms of microforms, but also millionaires that were made from that forms of style or owners. To understand different forms of work, it's not easy, especially when people work in art. So me actually have extreme prohibition and self-term not to work in art. Because poverty in art is made from work. To understand different forms of carvings in life, but also London folks, it's not easy. Those wooden carvings are actually far away from cheap and you will not find them very cheap. The patented figure is also not simple, especially if you see different patented wooden figure me made, but also appears together with imagery of literature or book or the way people see different forms of animals. To understand life also together with apple forms is not easy, but also to understand diverse fruits that appears in richer society. To understand those pictures it's not easy, but also in the way the sun and snow and cold weather exist. To understand different forms of life it's not easy, and also the forms what people do in their life. Sometimes people must forget everything and also clean themselves, especially in every form of extreme dirty art. The dirty arts are very difficult and usually related to a lot of work in art. Me have a lot of prohibitions for myself and terms for myself in art not to work with anything art or anything dirty. So it is for me also very important to understand different forms of psychology together with picture. Different forms of picture appears in different forms of culture, but also different forms of illusions. Sometimes illusions are harder and sometimes are not harder, but it's also not easy to understand pictures that are actually made from texture. The texture or textile together with different forms of interface culture is very, very acrylic. To understand those simple acryls together with different forms of dance is also not easy. And how complex dance would be once people see it. To understand different forms of abstractions in life, it's not easy, especially the abstractions about cities. Not easy to understand, extremely, extremely difficult wooden sculpture made only from clients' picture of me, but also some very, very difficult forms in life. To understand those carvings is very, very difficult. Some people actually do not understand wood, but also not the burning in different cultures around the world or in your city. If you understand simple city forms, you'll also understand meditation, but you'll also understand how some pictures are actually burning together with different forms of the culture. If there is fire, of course, there is also better life and better solutions. You should know that some extremely strange culture or more and more religion could actually block richer cultures, which is extremely terrible, especially in Africa. To understand different forms of how sad some people might be, especially if they are blocked. And they can also become frustrated because the upper or lower part are separated and they could not join with their soul. That might be extreme problem in some culture. To understand different forms of fashion, but also all the rooms around the world, it's not easy. And sometimes it is very, very easy to understand life, or at least we think so. But in truth, those of us and the imagery in this world are simply the horror of this world. To understand different forms, and those rooms might only be the pictures we are seeing. Whatever pictures we are seeing, we might only see ourselves or our own fortune, but nothing more. And the way we build the picture of life is not easy. Once you think about all the materials in this world or in your city, you'll see how difficult it is to get better and better games, better diamonds, or better sculpture. To understand sculpture that are in public place are usually made by basic culture politics, but of course are not advanced. To understand murmurs of different forms of pregnancy in this world or how some women become fat, it's also not easy. The abstractions also show different forms of legs, but also hands, and in cosmetics art that become quite difficult. And to understand different forms of abstractions, those are not for everyone. And there are millions of different styles, and some are more and more modern, but for me, much more 18th century. The humans united, it represents love, but from Taoist point, they represent the loss of vital energy. To understand different prayings of people or what they pray for, or to be united with any form of deity or humanity or religion, it's not easy. To understand abstract forms in life, it's also not easy, but also how modern people might look like in different forms of crisis. Different forms of stones appear together with each culture. And once you understand your culture, you also understand how it is very important to prohibit it for some people that might be extremely evil. The evil sometimes it's very difficult. And if you prohibit the culture for technological part, at least some part of culture, you might do a lot of good for humanity. To understand doing good is not easy, but also abstractions can easily cheaper, but it takes a lot of imagery to build better diamonds. Sometimes it's also very difficult to build two together and to build a simple diamond structure, but also different forms of shapes. To understand shapes, but also to understand life together with life, it's not easy. But sometimes it's also important to understand different wooden carvings, but also stone carvings in this world. Sometimes it's not easy to understand different forms of cat and dog statues because are very difficult even if you think in abstractions of real life of picture. Each day is much different and some people decide to build more humans from two and some decide to stay two forever. Some people are actually staying only one person, but some other people must unite with other to become simple perfect too. It is not easy to understand humanity or how humanity is next to each other if you mention any art. To understand different forms of simple humanity together with stone, it's also not easy. And once you see different forms of strong statue of stone together with man, that's extreme carving or extreme nonsense of what you are going to see. Sometimes it is very important to build imagery together with different forms, but also with different forms of illusional animal picture. Sometimes those pictures are actually not very much animal, but are in fact very difficult abstractions of real life. Sometimes it is very important to build safety in life, but also the sculpture that are actually building simple forms of life. No mobile, no radio, no TV. Sometimes life is only a picture, and once you know that, you'll see the medicine, you'll see the science, and you'll see millions of different stones and how they appear in different forms of life, or even different buildings together with this world. To understand the stone is extremely complex, but also different materials that different forms of medicine could use. Sometimes you should not win anything. Sometimes you should not achieve anything. Sometimes simple earning and simple receiving, giving and receiving is very important. All those imagery you see are representing some sort of different forms of stone, but also different forms of strong bond that human can have. Sometimes it is important to build image of self, but also give some things. Also in the forums, not to pray too much, but to build better stone and better psychology for your life. Life is very simple. If you build it in simple imagery, and very complex if you build it in complex form, but psychology, of course, can build a better and stronger sense of life.